Hi, this is Marina again. Welcome back to reading Mountains Beyond Mountains with me. Last time we discussed chapter 12 and 13. Dr. Paul Farmer is tackling a lot of medical problems in Haiti, such as multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Today we'll start with chapter 14. For several years during medical school, Farmer had boarded at St. Mary of the Angel, a parish run by a priest known as Father Jack. Farmer camped in a room under the eaves of the rectory. The church was in Roxbury, one of Boston's run-down neighborhoods, largely African American. In the musty, dim, low-ceilinged sanctuary, gospel music surrounded the Mass. The sermons had the feel of revival meetings. Jack Rolson, the priest, a beefy man with a florid complexion, would declaim on poverty and injustice, voices in the congregation calling out amens. Jack was the kind of priest whom nervous bishops call a character. He mediates arguments among neighborhood gangs, led candlelight vigils against drug dealing, carried signs in front of the State House protesting cuts in welfare. In his spare time, he liked to tell off-color stories and tease the young medical students upstairs. When Farmer began practicing vivisection, dog lab, it was called at the medical school, he had a long talk with Jack about his misgivings, working on a creature that he was going to kill. The next morning, Farmer awoke to what sounded like fingernails scratching on his door. Then imitations of whining, finally a few howls. Ophelia stayed at the rectory some time. She had mussed off the sheets in the room and the nuns assigned her, then crossed herself as she crept up the stairs to Paul's garret. Father Jack pretended not to notice, but he talked about Farmer's previous girlfriends in front of Ophelia just to see Paul blush. When Farmer created Partners in Health, he put Father Jack on the board of advisors. In early 1990s, Jack left St. Mary's for a church in a place called Carabello, a slum in the outskirts of Lima, Peru, on visits back to Boston. He kept telling Paul and Jim and Ophelia that PIH should start a project down there in his new parish. Jim agreed eagerly. For about 8 years, Jim had happily served, very happily, he insisted, as Paul's second in command, or, as one member of the organization put it, PIH's Bayako, Creole for a person who picks up excrement. He had answered the phone at PIH. He helped Paul get medications and appliances for Demi Lasante. Written grants and proposals when Paul had to get from the Brigham for a meeting, it was Jim who made sure he got there on time and who would escort him out of the hospital, saying, "Okay, pal, we're in a hurry. Only one hug and 2 kisses per janitor." Now Jim wanted to do more. He wanted to learn how to do what Paul had done in Haiti. Farmer wasn't enthusiastic, but he gave in. He did everything he could to help. First of all, he talked Tom White into putting up $30,000, half the initial cost of the project, and Farmer gave Jim advice and encouragement almost daily, often in phone calls between Lima and Cage. Jim planned to imitate part of Demi Lasante. He had created a system of community health workers in Carabello that they now call Socios en Salud, a Spanish version of Partners in Health. He imagined a small health improvement project, but he wasn't thinking small. He wasn't capable of that. He envisioned a project so well designed and managed that it would inspire imitation in other peri-urban slums all over the world. In photos from around this time, Jim appears as a neatly groomed well-proportioned young man, a few inches shorter than Farmer, with jet black hair swept into a knife-like wave and wire-rimmed glasses over narrow eyes. He had an expressive face. His eyes would disappear completely when he grinned. Oh, that's just like me. He was excited. He wrote a letter to Father Jack. I have purchased the 3-volume Pimsleur tape system and have committed myself to learning as much Spanish as I can quickly as I can. Are there any books that you would recommend on Peru? Almost as soon as he got to Lima, Jim started placing long-distance calls to Farmer. Pal, you won't believe what Father Jack just did. He is hiring all these people because he feels sorry for them, but they can't do the work. Paul would answer calmly, Don't confront, Jack. You're new there. Just keep on working. Various leaders in Carabello asked socios to build a pharmacy, which would dispense free medicine to the most impoverished people in the slum. Socios erected the pharmacy right next to Father Jack's church, but Peru was in the midst of a civil war between the government and the Shining Path guerrilla movement. Some of the guerrillas, it was said, used Carabello as a bedroom, and they had their own ideas about what was best for the slum. On midnight of New Year's Eve, while Jack was saying Mass, the pharmacy blew up. The church had a bank of glass front doors, but Jack liked to preach with them open, so none of the glass flew inward at the congregation. Word got back that guerrillas had planted the bomb because the pharmacy represented crumbs for the poor, a palliative designed to curb the growth of revolutionary fervor. Paul and Jim received the news philosophically. As a matter of fact, they were dispensing palliatives. They said, Partners in Health simply had the pharmacy rebuilt in a different spot. There were many frustrations, small and large, many occasions when Jim felt insulted. Paul would tell him, Remember, serving the poor in Carabello is more important than soothing your own ego. It's called eating shit for the poor. This sort of advice was always tonic for Jim. He'd feel as though catastrophe loomed. He'd call Paul and tell him about the problem, and Paul would say sympathetically, Yeah, I remember something like that happened 3 times in Cage. Farmer also traveled to Lima to conduct a health census on the slum, as Ophelia had helped him to do a decade ago in Cage. He found many of the same kinds of problems there, but none as acute. Naturally enough, after all his years in Haiti, he wondered if tuberculosis was a problem in Carabello. It had been, he learned. For a long time, TB control in Peru had been haphazard, but the country had recently created a nationwide program. They had done this with the advice and assistance from the World Health Organization, WHO, a branch of the United Nations. Its pronouncements carry a lot of weight in poor countries, and WHO had declared Peru's new TB control program the best in the developing world. The praise seemed justified to Farmer when he read the official data. He'd remember, a bit ruefully, telling Jim, The one thing we don't need to do here is TB. Then Father Jack got sick. In May 1995, he flew back to Boston, and Jim drove him to Brigham when the doctors diagnosed tuberculosis. The Brigham doctors put Jack on a standard regimen of 4 first-line TB drugs, a virtually foolproof cure for most cases, but Jack died about a month after starting therapy. A sample of his TB survived him in a culture in the Massachusetts State Lab, where it is being tested for drug susceptibility. The results arrived a day or 2 after Jack's death. They showed that the bacilli from his body were resistant to all 4 of the drugs he'd been given, and to the one other first-line drug as well. Well, that is very bad news because that shows that probably a lot of other people in Peru also has TB resistance. On the plane to Lima for the memorial service, Farmer wondered aloud to Ophelia over and over again what he should have done to save Jack. In the hotel room after the ceremony, it seems as if Paul would never stop weeping. When they went down to dinner and the waiter asked if they want to sit in the no-smoke area, Jim said, "How about a no-cry area?" And Paul kept on crying but started laughing as well. Sentiment and remorse became a goad. But the clinical facts of Jack's death were the real issue. They altered Farmer's view of Jim's project. Before, he had felt that if Jim really needed to do his own thing, Carabello was made for a reasonable site, another needy place where PIH could help. Now it seemed likely that they'd happened on something much more complicated, also more significant, and maybe even frightening. Father Jack had never before been treated for TB, so there was only one way he could have contracted a 5-drug resistant strain. He'd have to have caught it from someone else, most likely in Carabello. Back before Father Jack's death, while helping Jim on the health census, Farmer had asked the project director of Socios in Salud if drugs-resistant tuberculosis was a problem in the northern slums of Lima. The director, his name was Jaime Bayona, had examined the official records and found nothing. He had decided to look further, though he had gone to various public clinics and asked the doctors and nurses if they'd had any patients with highly resistant strains. Invariably, they said they did not. But often, Jamie noticed they paused before answering. Then he started asking his question in a different way. "Did you have any TB patients who came and were treated but weren't cured?" "Oh, sure," one nurse had replied, and had proceeded to introduce him to an impoverished woman from Carabello named Senora Brigida. Jamie visited her. She told him her story. A government clinic had treated her for TB, but she had relapsed. A second course of therapy had been interrupted by a strike of medical workers. The government of Alberto Fujimori had cut social service spending drastically, and the healthcare workers had gone out in protest. Eventually, her TB had been cultured and found to be resistant to 4 first-line drugs. She had been retreated again with those very same drugs, strangely enough, and now she was sick again and coughing blood. Along the way, doctors had accused her of non-compliance, and her son had died of TB, more than likely from a strain of the disease that he had caught from her. Jamie had related the story to Farmer in the Lima airport just before Paul caught a flight to Miami. Farmer had promised to find the drugs to treat Senora Brigida, and he'd pondered her case, looking down at Lima from the airplane. If drug-resistant TB was abroad in the crowded shanty towns, he reasoned, it would spread across that sprawling city. He thought, the Peruvian authorities are going to have to pay attention to this. But it seemed to Jamie Bayona that they were doing something like the opposite. Jamie was a Peruvian. He had been an altar boy for a priest friend of Jack, and he had earned a degree in public health. Jim had recruited him to direct Socios. Jim had liked him at once, this small, quiet man in his 30s, a man of understated smiles, always neatly dressed, always pushing his glasses back up onto the bridge of his nose. In the aftermath of Jack's death, Jamie stepped up his visits to the government clinics. He'd ask his question, and sometimes a nurse would bring out a stack of medical records and open them, saying, "We have something here that might interest you. but I can't show it to you." And Jamie would say, "Okay, fine." He'd put his glasses back into place and stare across the desk at the open files. Soon he'd taught himself to read patient records upside down. Again and again, he read stories of patients who hadn't been cured of standard chemotherapy or by repeated treatments with first-line drugs. He'd saunter out of the public center, then drive as fast as he could to the socio's office in Carabello, a concrete building that belonged to Father Jack's church, now named Father Jack Rusin Center. He'd hurry inside, sit down at his computer, and type up what he had read, and email addresses exclusively to Farmer and Kim. Now, chapter 15. So I think they're going to come up with some plans to treat multi-drug TB in Peru because it's apparently a big problem right now. I first saw Carabello at night in Farmer's company. The road from the airport, 4 lines and divided, felt very smooth, even after the driver turned away from the old Spanish colonial center and the skyscrapers of downtown and headed into the settlements of Lima's northern outskirts. In the median, palm trees rustled past. I gazed out the car window at hillsides, smothered in darkness, but dotted with twinkling lights, as if by Japanese lanterns, pretty in the night. "Lima doesn't seem like the third world," I said. "Oh, yes it is," said Farmer. "You see. Lima is a vast coastal city, vast and dry. In the daylight, the northern neighborhoods seemed like an endless spreading slum, the roads choked with traffic, with motorcycle, rickshaws, and minibuses that served as public transportation, and the banks of the roads littered with broken-down vehicles and garbage on fire, and with ramshackle-looking development, like American strip malls that had motored before being completed. On cement block walls, there were signs for bars and nightclubs and hairdressers, and everywhere it seemed for doctors, with the price for office visits painted on the walls. In the gloomy air of daytime Lima, the sun filtering down through thin fog from the Pacific, then through the perpetual ground-level strata of dust and hydrocarbons. I stood outside Socio's headquarters and looked up toward Carabello's hills and realized that the lights I'd seen the night before were mounted on highway-style pylons towering over 1- and 2-room shacks. The hovels were perched on the sides of steep gray-brown hills, giant heaps of sand and rock, and nothing growing on them, except for the shacks and a few little gardens beside them, and those weirdly outsized light poles. Many of the people in Carabello came from Andean villages. They had jet black hair and high cheekbones. When he first saw them trudging up and down those hills, which they themselves compared to the surface of the moon, even Farmer, with all his first-hand knowledge of Latin American poverty, felt viscerally puzzled. He thought of the places the settlers had left behind, imagining pictures of wild green mountains in coffee table books about the Incas. Looking up at the electric pylons, though, he guessed their reasons. People he talked to told a familiar story, like stories he had heard from peasants who had migrated to the slum of Port-au-Prince. They had come to Carabello in the hope of finding things their hometowns didn't have: electricity, clean water, school, medical care, and jobs, also distance from the war between the Shining Path and the Peruvian army. On one side of Carabello, on the lowland beside the road, there were stores, garages, vendors' carts, kiosks roofed with umbrellas. and on the side street and the lower hillside, thick clusters of small houses made of brick and concrete. The light poles and paved roads ascended the hills. The pavement turned to dust. Then roads turned into paths. And the house grew more and more provisional. Scattered among them, there were dirt-floored convenience stores, metal-roofed cook shacks, where residents bought dinner because they couldn't afford stoves and fuel for stoves. Barber shops, even graveyards. The air carried a strengthening smell of urine. There were no sewers up there. The only bathrooms, secluded places among the boulders above the last dwellings. I looked out to the north. In the distance I could see a river, a line of green, but all around and high above only dirt and rocks. A couple of children were playing nearby with a ball. It got away from them. I watched the ball bounce downhill until I lost sight of it, thinking of gravity, sewage, and disease. So far, the impression we're getting about Lima, Peru is not very good. It seems like it's not very sanitary, and a lot of people in desperate poverty are living there. On these hillsides and down in the lowlands, Jamie Bayona had found, rather quickly, 10 Carabellianos with probable MDR. To confirm the diagnosis, samples of each patient's TB had to be regrown in cultures and tested by drug susceptibility. The general procedure was more than a century old, but beyond the reach of many of the places in the world with the greatest burden of TB. Peru's national lab could do the work, but Socios didn't have access to it. Peru's national lab could do Farmer solved the problem that he had long since solved it in Haiti, where he couldn't get cultures done either. He took specimens from those 10 patients and packed the jars in his suitcase, eventually depositing them at the Massachusetts State Lab outside Boston. He labeled the jar Paul Farmer, TB Commissioner. He was, in fact, a member of the State TB Commission. He enjoyed these transnational diagnostic excursions. For him, small acts of redistribution. But the results of the cultures were alarming. When it came to treating MDR, every drug lost to resistance makes a cure more difficult and expensive. And most of the 10 patients in Carabello had TB resistant not only to the 2 most powerful drugs, but all 5 of the first-line antibiotics, just like Father Jack. In Farmer's experience, such severe resistance patterns were unusual, but here it seemed as if they might be the norm, and he wondered why. Farmer flew from Haiti to Lima, and Jamie Bayona took him straight from the airport to a small health clinic, run by the government, at the base of Carabello Hills next to Father Jack's former church, Cristo Luz del Mundo. A sign on the wall outside the clinic read El Progreso. It was a dusty little concrete building with a small cabinet of medicine in the corner. Most bathrooms in American homes were better stocked. The 10 patients were waiting, the American doctors inside. Farmer sat on a wooden bench, his stethoscope around his neck, and Jamie sat next to him to act as an interpreter. Farmer couldn't yet speak Spanish. One after the other, the 10 patients came in and sat down on a bench in front of Farmer. Some were so sick that they had to be carried in. He studied their chest x-rays, the outlines of the encysted cavities swarming with bacilli that TB had formed in the lungs of many. The extensive filtrants that appeared as streaks of white, like cirrus clouds, against a black background. The voids where TB and bacilli had eaten up the upper lobes of the lungs. He listened to their chests through his stethoscope, plugging his air into their lungs as it were, hearing the crackles down as rails. The sound of alveoli pulling open against fluid, and the prolonged wheezing called rhonchi, the patient's breath rushing through narrowed airways. Farmer was a TB expert. When he was just a resident at the Brigham, he had written treatment manuals for the house staff. He had been diagnosing and treating the disease ever since he had ever set foot in Haiti, where nearly everyone was infected and active cases were rampant. Now, as he studied the 10 patients' record, he was aware of a difference from the Haitian norm. In Cage, his MDR patients usually told stories of therapy interrupted by a strike or a flood or the abrupt closing of the clinic. Stories, that is, of severe resistance arising from too little medicine. These 10 patients from Carabello had a different kind of case history. They had received a free treatment daily under the auspice of the National TB Program, strictly in accordance with the guidelines established by WHO. They had undergone what WHO called DOTS. The initials stand for Directly Observed Treatments, Short Course Chemotherapy, a very effective and inexpensive strategy, the same strategy Zami Lasante had been using for years. Farmer called DOTS the most significant advance in TB control since the advent of antibiotics. He applauded WHO's plan to spread it all over the world, but here in Carabello, for these 10 patients at least, something had gone wrong. The first round of DOTS hadn't cured them. When that happened, WHO guidelines called for retreatment with the same antibiotics, plus one. This prescription came from clinical trials in Africa, where it had worked well. In those trials, it seemed that most treatment failures arose because of patient noncompliance, because they hadn't taken all their pills, not because they were infected with highly drug-resistant strains. So when a patient failed a standard therapy, it seemed reasonable to try again, by merely strengthening the regimen a little and making sure all doses were taken. But the African studies were more than 20 years old, and Peru was in Africa. For one thing, Peru hadn't used the same drugs during its period of chaotic TB control. And dusty little clinics though this was, it had done its job properly. Farmer fell short of that. The patient's record showed they had swallowed their pills under the direct observation of nurses and aides. Through Jamie, Farmer asked them, one after the other, if they had taken all their doses. When they answered, saying that they had, he stared at their eyes. He had been a doctor long enough, he felt, to sense a lie. He believed these people. 3 of them were themselves health workers. They knew what pills they were supposed to take, and they too claimed they followed the doctor's orders. Farmer leafed through their records, Jamie leaning over his shoulder, translating. These 10 people had all been sick for a long time. They'd been treated for DOTS, then treated again, and many had undergone further treatments. And now all of them had 4 and 5 drug resistance. In his mind, Farmer reviewed the possible explanations. He had already ruled out noncompliance, he felt. And poor drug quality couldn't be blamed. International experts had certified the drug's effectiveness, and these patients couldn't have caused the same highly resistant strain, because each one's TB had a slightly different pattern of resistance. There was one other possibility. Suddenly, suspicions that had been forming in Farmer's mind seemed likely, indeed inescapable. I'm getting very excited. I want to know the final reason why so many people have drug resistance. The dynamic of tuberculosis makes it nearly impossible for a person to acquire resistance to more than one drug at a time. But repeated improper therapy can select for increasingly resistant mutants and create strains resistant to any number of drugs. This was what must have happened to these 10 people, Farmer thought. They had gone to the clinics with one, or more likely 2 drug resistant. And through treatment and repeated treatments under the standardized dot formulas, they had emerged with 4 or 5 drug resistance. The biological principles were elementary. It wasn't as if Farmer imagined that he had come up with new science, but for a moment, sitting on the bench at the clinic, the pieces falling together in his mind, he felt an old familiar pleasure. The motion of his mind toward root causes had always excited him. He loved the challenge of diagnosis and its accoutrement, the strains on the microscopic slides, the beautiful morphologies of the creatures under the lens. But what he called the eureka moment had a bad aftertaste this time. Later he would tell me, God, I hate to ever feel triumphant after something so rotten. So Dr. Farmer realized the truth, but he is also very sad because it means that this is a very bad situation. There was a proper procedure for dealing with resistance. When a patient didn't get better on standard therapy, a doctor should suspect that the TB was impervious to some drugs in the regimen and should find out which drugs as quickly as possible and substitute others. Giving patients the wrong drug was both useless and dangerous. It could lead to what infectious disease specialists call recruitment of further resistance. The term exactly described the process that Farmer saw in the 10 patients' records. He chose to call the process amplification because the term sounded worse. These 10 Peruvians had gone to the doctor sick and emerged. About 2 years later, sicker, their TB becoming resistant to more and more drugs as it went on, eating their lungs. Not because they hadn't followed the doctor's orders, but precisely because they did. And those orders weren't simply acts of stupidity or carelessness. They were enshrined as official policy. They came from on high, from the people in charge of Peru's TB program, who had gotten them from Geneva, from the World Health Organization itself. The story, as Farmer pieced it together, became increasingly painful. After amplifying resistance in these 10 patients, the national program had essentially abandoned them. Tuberculosis patients could consult private pulmonologists, but they had to pay for the visit and the very expensive second-line drugs the pulmonologist prescribed. Farmer and Kim and Bayona would soon meet people whose family had sold out most of their meager possessions and had bought as much of those drugs as they could. Not enough to get cured, however, only enough to acquire still further resistance. Others had given up and gone back to their shacks on the barren, dusty hillsides and were waiting there to die. In effect, WHO had prescribed this for them too. The official DOTS manual contained the following statement. In settings of resource constraint, it is necessary for rational resource allocation to prioritize TB treatment categories according to the cost effectiveness for treatment in each category. Farmer and Kim began collecting a number of official WHO statements. Some put the case more plainly. In developing countries, people with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis usually die, because effective treatment is often impossible in poor countries. For Farmer and for Jim and Jamie, there was a larger principle involved. A TB epidemic, laced with MDR, had visited New York City in the late 1980s. It had been centered in prisons, homeless shelters, and public hospitals. When all the costs were totaled, various American agencies had spent about $1 billion stanching the outbreak. Meanwhile, here in Peru, where the government made debt payments of more than $1 billion every year to American banks and international lending institutions, experts in international TB control had deemed MDR too expensive to treat. Wow, that is very interesting to learn that the drug resistance strain of tuberculosis was caused by following protocols that were supposed to be good, but turns out they weren't so good. So I think Dr. Farmer is gonna start treating them, but it's gonna be expensive and it's gonna take a lot of effort. Well, we'll see. Thank you for staying with me today. We'll see you next time.